I am Caitlin Wester and Vicki Wester's mommy. And I like to volunteer with this jam. And this year, they asked me to help with Space Day. So I asked my friend, Captain Hoot Gibson, to come talk to you. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about him. But first of all, can y'all read my shirt? He checked. He's been to space 5 times. I know. Okay. He is actually a retired naval officer. That means he was in the Navy after he went to college. He went to college at California Polytechnical University, and he got a degree in aerospace engineering. Now, how many of your grown-ups work at NASA or are an engineer? Lots of your grown-ups, right? How many of you, just raise your hand, don't need to talk, just put your hand down, none of yours are engineers. How many of you have heard of the movie Maverick or Top Gun? Guess who was a student at Top Gun? Yep. And he's a Navy test pilot. And guess how many different kinds of aircraft he knows how to fly? 150. I didn't even know there were 150 different kinds. But like I said, he was in the very first astronaut candidate school. That means the first time they selected astronauts, Captain Hoot was picked. That's pretty special. And he's been to space, like I said, 5 times on the space shuttle. One time, he was the pilot, because, you know, he's a really good pilot. The other 4 times, he was what they call mission commander. Do you know what that is? It's the boss of all the other astronauts on the trip. So, let's give a very big Space Day welcome to Captain Gibson.
Thank you very much. Okay, let's talk about space, shall we? Okay, the first picture that I got up here is a picture of a Space Shuttle Discovery. Now, what's interesting about the Space Shuttle Discovery is that's the only space shuttle I didn't fly. But my wife flew the Space Shuttle Discovery. So is it only boys that get to be astronauts? No, girls get to be astronauts too, don't they? Okay, well, I met my future wife in my astronaut class, which was the first time we had selected astronauts for the space shuttle. And she and I married 3 years later, and she went to space 3 times as well. So this is Discovery. That's the one I did not fly, but she did. So between the 2 of us, we flew all 5 space shuttles. This isn't working. Okay, now it's working. All right, this was my first launch. This was aboard the Space Shuttle Challenger. And I know when you watch videos of it, it looks like it's really slow when it lifts off, doesn't it? But you know what? By the time our tail gets up to the top of this tower, we're already going 100 miles an hour. Okay, we'll do questions after I finish showing the slides, okay? So think of your questions, because that's what we'll do. Now, so we're 100 miles an hour when we get to the top of there. This is where we are 2 minutes later. And it looks like we're going down in this picture, doesn't it? Yeah, actually we're not. You know what we're doing? We're high enough now. At the end of 2 minutes, we are already 30 miles above the Earth. And we're 30 miles out over the Atlantic Ocean and going 3,000 miles an hour. Have any of you ever gone 3,000 miles an hour? No, I don't think so. I never had until I first flew the space shuttle. It's the world's fastest airplane. And that's where we are when we are getting ready to separate the two great big white solid rocket boosters, okay? And here's what that looks like. We cut them loose from the side of the big orange fuel tank. They're attached to the big orange fuel tank. And you can see there are rocket motors on the nose and on the tail that push those rocket boosters away from us, because once we cut them loose, we don't want to hit them again. They weigh 88,000 pounds empty of fuel. And so you don't want to impact them after you've separated away. Now, we did a lot of exciting things on my first mission. Probably the most exciting thing was this. We sent 2 of our mission specialists outside. We don't let the pilot astronauts do spacewalks. You've probably seen this photo before, haven't you? Yeah. It gets used everywhere. Well, I'm the one that took that photo, because during the spacewalk, I was the co-pilot on my first mission, and I was the only one who didn't really have a whole lot of things to do, didn't have a lot of things to worry about, so I was at the window taking photos, and I'll show you a picture in just a moment. This was the very first time ever that an astronaut had done a spacewalk without being tethered or tied to the spaceship, because you don't want to float away and get lost in space. So they're always tethered. They're always fastened to the space shuttle or to the International Space Station. But this was the very first time that we did an untethered spacewalk. And this is Bruce McCandless, and he has a camera up here, and I'm going to show you a picture in just a second that he took. He's using a rocket backpack, and he used it to fly away from the space shuttle. And you can see how far away he went. Now, people ask me all the time, well, what happens if he ran out of fuel? What happens if he had an electrical problem with his rocket backpack? Well, the answer was, we could fly Challenger. This was aboard Challenger on my first flight. We could fly Challenger over to him to pick him up. Nothing like that happened. Everything went perfectly fine. And here's one of the pictures that he took of us. I showed you where that camera was, up over his right shoulder. So he took this picture of us because we had rocket motors on the nose and back here on the tail of Challenger, and you can just barely see, that says Challenger right there. We have rocket motors, so we could fly over and pick him up if we needed to. Nothing like that happened. The test of the rocket backpack was completely successful, and so nothing went wrong with it. Now, we stayed up in space for 8 days altogether, and then we came back and landed the first time at Cape Canaveral. This was the 10th time we had sent a space shuttle to space. This was February of 1984, a long, long time ago. And we made the very first landing back at Cape Canaveral, and you can see our launch pads right back here. This was the very first time ever that a spaceship had landed where it had taken off from. Well, I'm not going to tell you about all my missions, but I'm just going to point out some of the highlights. This was my 4th trip to space, and this was aboard the Space Shuttle Endeavour. And we were a science mission. We were carrying the Space Lab laboratory, and we were working 24 hours around the clock. So we had half of the crew was called the red crew, and the other half of the crew was the blue crew. And so while the blue crew was working, the red crew was sleeping, and then the red crew would sleep while the blue crew, that's hard to say, blue crew was working. So every 12 hours, we would have a shift change. And what we're doing here is I'm taking notes in my notebook. I was the mission commander, and I'm taking notes to make sure I record how much we got accomplished on that previous shift, because then we pick up on the next shift. Now you notice, do we walk when we're up in space? No, what happens if I try to stand on the floor? I'll float away, yes. So the way we keep ourselves in one spot, if you look right here, you can see I've got my foot slipped into a little foot loop. Now you notice, nobody's wearing shoes. Do we need to wear shoes? No, because we're not walking anywhere. We don't have to climb stairs, we don't have to walk, but everybody just wears socks while we're up there in space. And this is all you need to keep yourself in one spot. That way I have both hands free to write with. And it's really convenient to be weightless, meaning floating up in space, because when I want to turn the page of my notebook, I can just park my pen right here, flip the page, grab my pen and keep writing. What happens if I try to do that down here? If I let go of my pen right here, we had one of the astronauts came back from space and he was signing an autograph, and the lady asked him, would you sign the next page too? And he let go of his pen right here and he turned the page and he went, where'd my pen go? So you get in the habit of doing things like that when you're up in space. Well, his pen wasn't floating right here, it was down on the floor. So it makes people worry about us a little bit. And for the teachers, they think, well, maybe it's lack of oxygen and space radiation that has fried our brains while we were up in space. Well, we stayed up 8 days on that mission, and then came back and landed back at Cape Canaveral. This was my 4th trip to space, and again, this was aboard the Space Shuttle Endeavour. Well, for my final mission, I trained over here. Does anybody know where this is? Where is it?
India.
No, India's a good guess, but no, it's not India.
England.
Yes, okay, good. This is Russia. I trained over in Russia. And so my whole crew and I went over to Russia, and we trained over there twice for a total of about 20 days altogether. Because we were selected, this was my final trip to space, we were selected to do the first docking ever done by a space shuttle, and it was with the Russian space station called Mir. Now we had to learn to speak Russian, because the Russians couldn't speak English, and way back then, they didn't have enough money to hire English teachers or buy English books, so we had to learn to speak Russian. And I'm not very good at speaking Russian, but I can carry on a very poor conversation in Russian. Anytime I have to speak to somebody in Russian, I will always start off by saying this. Я говорю по-русски очень плохо и понимаю ничего, which is, I speak Russian very badly and I understand nothing. Because I didn't want them to have too high an expectation. But when I launched to go to the Russian space station, I was carrying a change-out crew. I was carrying 2 Russians with me to take over the space station, and I picked up the 3 Russians who were up there and gave them a ride home. And so on the trip to space, if we needed to talk to the Russians, we had to talk to them in Russian. So I'm not really good at Russian, but I can carry on a very poor conversation in Russian. Well, this was the approach to the docking, and I'm flying Atlantis now by hand, and what I had to do was fly my docking ring, which is right here in the cargo bay, up into contact with the docking ring on the Russian space station, and then once we got there, the 2 mission commanders shook hands. So I'm shaking hands with Russian Air Force Colonel Vladimir Dezhurov, who had been a Russian MiG pilot, training to shoot me down all those years when I was a Navy fighter pilot, training to shoot him down. And for the teachers, the President of the United States announced that day that this handshake marks the end of the Cold War. So I ended the Cold War. It makes a funny story. We went over into the Mir space station because we were allowed to go anywhere we wanted inside the station because we had trained over there and knew which doors not to open and which windows not to open and that sort of thing. And for the teachers, this is the traditional boundary between Europe and Asia, well, for everybody, where Europe is over here on the right side. This is Turkey under the clouds. This is the Crimean Peninsula, which has been very much in the news lately. And this is Ukraine, right here. It isn't real clear, but this is Ukraine, which has been very much in the news lately. So we spent 5 days docked with the Russian space station, and this is a picture that we got right before we undocked. which means unattaching ourselves, if you will, from the space station. And this is as we were separating away. We moved out to a distance of about 500 feet and said goodbye to the Russian space station and said goodbye to the 2 cosmonauts who we had given a ride up to space in the space shuttle. This is the only time ever that there was a Russian crew exchange using an American spacecraft. We stayed up in space 2 more days and then came back to land. What's this? A hurricane. Very good. We have had a hurricane in the news lately. I'm sure you all know Hurricane Ian has done a lot of damage down in Florida. This was on my 4th mission, and this was Hurricane Bonnie out in the Atlantic Ocean. This was the picture we took from the Space Shuttle Endeavour. This is another picture that we took. This is another picture that we took, and we're looking at Egypt in this picture. This is the Nile River, which flows from south to north into the Mediterranean Sea. And from space, the only things on Earth that look gray colored or silver colored are cities. So right here, this is Cairo, Egypt, the capital of Egypt. And the bright spots in the sand right here, those are the pyramids. So you can actually see the pyramids from space if you know right where to look. Okay, the next picture, you had a glimpse of it just a second ago. What does this look like at night? Looks pretty beautiful at night. So we get to enjoy this really beautiful view, not just in the daytime, but in the nighttime as well. And if you look at this picture, there sure are a lot of people living along the Nile River because we humans need water, don't we? We cannot live without water. So where there's water, there's lots of us. Along the river, in the delta, this is Cairo, very brightly lit up. And I've always used to point to this picture and say, you know, if you move away from the Nile River, there's not much out there. And I said, I have no idea who this is out here. But last week, when I taught at Space Camp, there was a young man from Egypt. And he said, I know what that is. He said, those are monasteries out there. So that's why they're lit up, but they sure are out there by themselves. Okay, here's a quiz for you. Where's this?
Italy.
Yes, very good, Italy. So another pretty nighttime picture. So that's what Italy looks like, lit up, all lit up at night. We get to see lots of sunrises and sunsets. Because picture this now, we are circling the Earth in just an hour and a half. So we're in the daylight for 45 minutes, and then darkness for 45 minutes, daylight for 40, so we see the sun go up and down 16 times a day. Okay, but that's not the prettiest thing we get to see from space. The next slide is the prettiest thing we get to see from space. Yes, the aurora. Okay, all right, we need to be quiet. Okay, I know this is very enjoyable, but... Okay, so we get to see there are 2 auroras. There's 2 auroras. Most of us are familiar with the northern lights, the aurora borealis. It's a ring of light around the North Pole. There is also the other aurora, the southern lights, the aurora australis, and it is also a ring way up in the atmosphere, at the top of the atmosphere around the South Pole. So we get to see both auroras when we're up in space. Okay, when we would come back to land, this is what a space shuttle would look like. Now this is a wind tunnel model, so this is a model of a space shuttle in a wind tunnel simulating a re-entry. And it would create this shock wave in the air in front of the space shuttle, and the temperature in that shock wave would be 9,000 degrees. And that's what this looked like from inside the space shuttle. It looks like the air is on fire around us, but it's much hotter than any fire, 9,000 degrees. And then we get down to where we are just a glider. We're a 230,000 pound glider. And so you only get one try to land it. We hold the landing gear right up until the very last moment. And then when we're only 300 feet above the runway, we throw out the landing gear because it slows us down and makes us come down quicker. So then we touch down and we have this big parachute behind the space shuttle to help us get stopped. And then if you've done everything right, you survive your trip to space, you get to pose for cool photos like this one. So this was part of my crew. The other 4 were the 3 Russians who had been up in space for 4 months. They're in wheelchairs right now because we put them into rehabilitation. And one of my astronauts, one of my American astronauts, Dr. Ellen Baker, who was a doctor, was helping with the 3 cosmonauts. Well, you probably know way back in 2011, 11 years ago, we flew the very last space shuttle flight, and it was Atlantis. It went up to the International Space Station and stayed up there for 14 days, and then came back and landed, finishing off 135 launches of the space shuttle. Well, for years after that, you know, we are still working aboard the International Space Station, but in order to get there and back to Earth, we had to ride with the Russians. And the Russians were charging us a lot of money to carry our astronauts to space. Well, along came SpaceX, and now we have the SpaceX Crew Dragon and the SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket to carry our astronauts up to space. And the Crew Dragon can fly itself up into orbit, and it can fly itself over to dock with the International Space Station. There's one other rocket that we have, and it has made one flight so far without people in it, so it's been one flight that's unmanned. But it's going to be a Boeing Starliner, and it will be available to carry our astronauts up to the International Space Station as well. But I want to talk about, this is the last slide. This is the future. This is the SLS rocket, which stands for Space Launch System. It's the largest rocket ever built. This is the biggest rocket that's ever been built. And it's going to launch next month on either November the 14th or the 16th or the 19th. It will be unmanned. It's not going to have any people in it when it goes, because for the first test flight, we want to check it all out and make sure everything is good with it before we put people on it. But it's going to go back to the moon. It's going to circle the moon for somewhere between 6 and 10 days, and then the capsule, the Orion capsule, which is the white part right at the very top, is going to come back to Earth. It's going to land in the ocean, we're going to retrieve it, and we're going to use a whole lot of the electronics that are mounted inside it for the second launch. The second launch is going to have Americans on board, and it's going to go back to the moon. They're not going to land on the moon, but they're going to go back and circle the moon, and then the third time we launch this rocket, we're going to land Americans on the moon again. When we landed on the moon back in the 1960s and 1970s, did we ever put a woman on the moon? No. So who do you suppose we are going to put on the moon this time? Yes. I guarantee you the first person to step out of the vehicle onto the surface of the moon is going to be an American woman. So we are finally going to have that happen. So this is where we are with the space program. This is our future. This vehicle is powerful enough to go to the moon. It's also powerful enough to take us to Mars. And NASA would like to go to Mars. We'd like to send astronauts to Mars. It's probably not going to happen until about 2030. But this is our future. This is where our future is going to be. So with that, if we have time, Miss Cindy, do we have some time? I guess we got a few minutes. Okay, we would have some time for questions.
Just questions, no stories.
Did any of the teachers have questions that they came up with over their group? Okay. Do you want to choose or do you want the teachers to pick one from the
Yeah, let's see, I guess I'll have to walk around. I have to look around with this. Okay, good question. Was I scared for my first flight? The answer is no, I wasn't scared. Now, you knew when you went to space, there's some chance that things could go wrong. You probably might know that we lost the Space Shuttle Challenger and its crew, and we lost the Space Shuttle Columbia and its crew. But I went to space 5 times and came back. Most of the time we succeed, so there is some risk about it. However, we had trained so very extensively in classroom training and also in simulators that we felt like we knew how to handle basically anything that could happen to us, except for a major catastrophe. So you weren't scared when you went to space. You were prepared to handle everything that you could handle. There are some things that you can't, but no, I wasn't scared. You knew there was some chance it wouldn't turn out well.
You kids just go when they come off the space shuttle.
Okay, where did the great big, the booster rockets, when they come off, the booster rockets, great question, I didn't cover that. When the booster rockets would come off the sides of the space shuttle, they drop into the Atlantic Ocean, but they landed under big parachutes. Each one had 3 huge, giant parachutes on them. And those would lower them gently down into the ocean. We had 2 ships that would go out there and pick them up and tow them back in. We would take them apart, send them back to Utah, and they would get reloaded with fuel, and we would use them over again. So that's what the booster rockets were.
Was it your dream to be an astronaut?
When did I dream of being an astronaut? Oh, okay, did I always want to be an astronaut? Well, actually, no. My dad was an aeronautical engineer and a test pilot, and I wanted to be just like my dad. So I wanted to be an aeronautical engineer and a test pilot. I wasn't really interested in going to space because back then, we didn't have the space shuttle. So I was an airplane person. I wanted to fly things that had wings. And all of a sudden, they came up with the space shuttle, and that's the world's fastest airplane. And at the time, I was flying the F-14 Tomcat, the airplane that we saw in the movie Top Gun. I was flying F-14 Tomcats. And I remember saying, wow, that space shuttle flies even higher and faster than the Tomcat. I want to fly that. So that's when I first got interested in being an astronaut. I'm going to move over here to see the airplane. There's a young, very excited lady.
Are you ever going to go back to space?
Do I want to go back to space? I would love to, but you know what? You know what they're going to tell me? They're going to tell me 2 things. First off, they're going to say, Hoot, didn't you already have your turn 5 times? Well, yeah, the answer is yes. And so haven't I already been greedy enough going 5 times? I probably could go again, but I needed to get out of the way and give the younger guys a turn on flying the space shuttle. So my wife and I left. It's been quite a while ago. We left the space program because we would have kept using up the spot that the younger astronauts could do. So I had my turn. So I'd love to go back, but they're not going to invite me to go back. Great question. You mean you didn't have a question for me?
When did you go to space?
Okay, when did I go to space? Well, I went 5 different times. My first time was 1984, when I was aboard the Challenger. 1986, I was the mission commander of Columbia. 1988, mission commander of Atlantis. 1992, the mission commander of Endeavour. And in 1995, the mission year government as the commander as well. Okay, I have an astronaut ask your question.
Did you see any aliens on the moon?
Okay, well, I didn't go to the moon, but we're not going to see aliens on the moon. We have found no evidence whatsoever of any kind of life other than here on the Earth. So we have never discovered any aliens. Now it would be really exciting to discover life somewhere else other than Earth. But so far we have found no evidence of it. So there weren't any aliens for us to discover.
Have you ever walked on the moon?
Okay, did I ever walk on the moon? No, the only place that I ever went was orbiting the Earth. So that was the purpose of the space shuttle, was to launch things off the surface of the Earth into orbit around the Earth and drop off satellites and build the International Space Station. So we weren't designed to go beyond the Earth. Now, the SLS rocket is going to let us go way beyond the Earth and go back to the moon. So I never got to go to the moon. It would have been fun, but I didn't get to.
Did you have any snacks?
Did you have any snacks? Well, yes. The missions were 8, 10 days, 12 days, 14 days. Yeah, so we better have food on board. So we carried plenty of food to get by. So if your mission was planned to be 8 days, we would actually stow 10 days of food on board. 10 days of fuel, 10 days of oxygen, 10 days of fuel, just in case we had to get extended up there. Because on my second mission, we were supposed to land on a particular day. The weather was no good, so we were going to try the next day. The weather was still no good. So then finally, on the third day, we had to land someplace other than where we were supposed to. We had to land out in California instead of at Cape Canaveral. So we always carried extra food, extra fuel, extra oxygen for an additional 2 days beyond. But at that point, we're going to have to come back and land. So that was, yeah, so we had snacks and food.
How did you get that one right there out of the ocean?
Oh, okay. Well, the SLS rocket hasn't flown yet, but those two booster rockets are going to be the same sort of a plan with the SLS rocket. They're going to separate at 2 minutes and fall down in the ocean. Now, I'm not sure they're going to retrieve those booster rockets. It might be that it was more expensive to retrieve the booster rockets, and so we're just going to let them fall into the ocean. But they're going to work just like the space shuttle, where they would drop off. Are we going to do a couple more? Okay.
What does it look like in space?
Okay, what does it look like in space? Well, we saw some of the pictures of it. The view is really spectacular because the highest they ever went was 275 miles up above the Earth. And when you fly in an airliner, you have a pretty good view of the United States, don't you? You can see a long, long ways. Well, from 200 miles up, oh my gosh, you can see about 3,000 miles in all directions. So the view is just spectacular. You never get tired of watching the Earth roll. So that's very exciting.
Have you ever repaired a satellite?
Have I ever repaired a satellite? No, I didn't do that. Although, let's see, the missions that I was on, altogether, I had launched 4 satellites. So I carried 4 satellites in space and taken them out of the cargo bag in the space shuttle and turned them loose. Now, many times on the space shuttles, we had repaired satellites. So that was something that had never been done before until we got the space shuttles. So great question, but I never had a repair mission of my life.
Do you ever have to fix, like, the fuel tank? Does it ever leak?
Well, yeah, once in a while the fuel tanks leak, but we don't launch if we have a fuel tank leak. So in fact, with the SLS rocket, we had it on the launch pad and they did a fueling test. They weren't going to send it to space, but they were going to check it out. And when they fueled it, they had a fuel leak, and so they had to stop the test, repair the leak, and then we had a subsequent test because the fuel that we carry is liquid hydrogen. liquid hydrogen is really hard to keep it inside the fuel tank. So it takes some really good technology to be able to work with fertilizer. So once in a while, we have fuels. I didn't talk to anybody from over here, we have to come to the room. So how about this one? Okay, all right. How do you sleep when you're the pilot? Well, a lot of people are surprised to hear that when it's time to sleep, we all sleep at the same time. There's nobody awake keeping an eye on the space shuttle. However, we have lots of alarms and lots of warning systems built in, so if something goes wrong, it'll turn on an alarm and it'll wake us up. And I've had that happen to me about 1/3 of the nights that I've been in space, where we'd be asleep at 2 o'clock in the morning, and an alarm would go off. So of course you're going to wake up, you're going to turn on the cathode ray tube, the display, and see what the problem is. And frequently, as the commander, I can fix it all by myself, and I don't have to wake everybody else up. In addition, we have mission control monitoring us all the time. So while we're sleeping, they're still awake down in mission control, and they can wake us up. Well, that's all the time we have, boys and girls. I sure enjoyed getting to speak with you, and I hope you enjoy hearing all about what it's like to go to space. So thank you very much. The teachers are being shy. Yeah, the question was, do I know about DART? And DART is the double asteroid retargeting test, where we intentionally crash a NASA satellite into an asteroid that was a couple 100,000 miles away from the Earth to test, can we, in the future, if we have an asteroid that's going to strike the Earth and possibly destroy the Earth, can we redirect it? That's what the DART is. Double asteroid redirect test, I guess is what it was. So yeah, the DART mission just successfully completed where we crashed a satellite into a small asteroid to see if we can deflect it and move it to the side like a gliding lift on one of our spacecraft. So yeah, that was the DART mission. That just happened I think last week.
Okay, I think we're gonna start, just gonna say